you miss me? I've been out of a comatose, but the depression.
Hello and welcome to Controlled Burns, the weekly hobby list podcast from me, your host, Andrew Burns or Slow Burn from Wildfire Gaming. Gonna go back this week to the continuation of the 100 greatest artists list that I have been putting together over the last, I guess, about a month at this point. I know we had a little bit of a detour last week with Reagan and I talking about our uh, history and fandom with Villainous board game, and I enjoyed that discussion. And I do want to return to that. I've been really into Villainous lately, and I'm a member of a Villainous group on Facebook, and we actually I posted the episode there, and we actually got a pretty decent response for our podcast standards, at least on in terms of the viewership of that episode, and hopefully people enjoyed that. So we are going to go back to that for when we rank the characters and whatnot. But obviously want to continue on the mini at this point series that we've already started. And one of those is, of course, and maybe kind of the main series right now is the top 100 artists. So this is going to be week 3 of that list where we're going to go through numbers 60 through 41. And then we'll have 2 episodes left when we get into the top, 40 through 21, and then of course the top 20 in week 5. So hopefully you've enjoyed the journey so far, and we're going to continue it here in this episode. So before we get into the list, just a reminder that Controlled Burns is a weekly hobby list podcast with a particular focus on lists and topics related to video games, music, TV, and film, as well as other hobbies and aspects of pop culture. If you're interested in writing into the podcast and having your comments or questions read on air, you can at ControlledBurnes with an ES at gmail.com. Okay, so I didn't remember if you remember back in week 2, actually there were a few changes that I made to the list. That is not the case this time. The list is pretty well locked in at this point, I think. But I will go ahead and provide a recap of the bottom 40 before we get into numbers 60 through 41, in case you missed those, or you want to go back and listen to those, or just need a refresher on where we were, especially since it's been a couple weeks since the last episode. So, running down the list for the bottom 40 of this list, number 100 is Martin O'Donnell, the Halo composer. 99 is Restless Heart. 98 is Camper Van Beethoven. 97 is Jane's Addiction. 96 is The Evening Rig. 95 is The Cure. 94 is Green Sky Bluegrass. 93 is Mitsudo Suzuki. 92 is James Newton Howard. 91 is M83. 90 is Iggy and the Stooges. 89 is Austin Wintory. 88 is Jay Mascis. 87 is Billy Joel. 87 Billy Joel. 86 is Florence and the Machine. 85 is Takeshi Hama. 84 is Tadayoshi Makino. 83 is Yasunori Mitsuda. 82 is Stephen Malkmus and the Jicks. 81 is Waxahachie. 80 is Bill Elm and Woody Jackson. 79 is Darlene Love. 78 is Julia Jacklin. 77 is Bon Iver. 76 is Atomic Tom. 75 is The Velvet Underground. 74 is Sharon Van Etten. 73 is Ryan Adams. 72 is Robin. 71 is Swearin. 70 is The Who. 69 is Brett Dennen. 68 is Ashley McBride. 67 is The War on Drugs. 66 is Free Cake for Every Creature. 65 is Ashley Monroe and the Pistol Annies. 64 is Adam Scorpa. 63 is Michael Giacchino. 62 is Melandrew. And 61, where we left off last week or a couple weeks ago, was Don Henley and the Eagles. So those are the bottom 40 of this list, and I got 20 spots now ready to go for our discussion this week. So number 60 on this list, first new addition, is another composer. This guy goes by the name of Matthew Dennis. So obviously he's not the first composer or relative unknown on this list, but he is the first that is so unknown that I was actually unable to find more than like one picture of him, which I'm gathering pictures for the different artists to for a list that's going to be going up on the soundtrackonline.com, which is my website, and you'll be able to go through the list and actually see all of the entries along with the little things, little paragraphs that I've written about each of them. But yeah, he I only found the one picture for Matthew Dennis, so he might. I mean, he's not the lowest in terms of uh monthly listeners on Spotify, I don't think, because right now he is sitting at 25,583, which is actually not bad for compared to some of the other even smaller acts that I have here. But in terms of just really having his face out there with the name, he could be, the most obscure. Um, as far as I can tell, he only also has a single project to his name, so that might be why he is so obscure. But it is an incredible project. It is Netflix's original documentary, My Octopus Teacher. It's one of the most memorable and moving pieces of filmmaking I've ever seen, and I think big part of that is Dennis' score, which is equally, I would say, memorable and moving. I would certainly be loath to spoil the developments of this film, and what happens during it, for those who haven't seen it, and I would highly recommend pretty much literally every human being walking the earth to watch that documentary. It's only going to enrich your life. But I will go ahead and let you know that it is a tearjerker, and that is in no small part thanks to Dennis' atmospheric and piano laden score. You don't even have to have seen. I mean, obviously there's no spoilers in this music that Dennis created. It's all instrumental. You don't have to have seen a second of the documentary to feel the emotion behind some of the best work in there, like my favorite, which is called "Not Just a Visitor." But if you have, then you'd be hard pressed to make it through. I mean, it's only a 3 minute composition, but you'd be hard pressed to make it through it without shedding a tear if you understand the context of it. So, yeah, really great work from Matthew Dennis. And again, I want to reiterate here that I kind of have a unique approach, I guess, to this list where, I think for a lot of top 100 artist lists that you'll see from a lot of the bigger outlets. It's a lot more focused on a full career retrospective and everything they did and their longevity and all of that kind of thing. And I think that is a reasonable metric criteria to use for when creating a list like this. But my list, I wanted to come at it in a little bit different, and so we're really celebrating just the peaks of their careers, like these artists at their best, the people the best output that they've created, and that kind of puts a little bit of a different spin on it. I definitely do give more credit in many cases to those that have been around for a longer period of time and those that have a larger body of work to their name. But at a certain point, whenever they have created something, even if it's just one thing that's just really incredible and really touching to me, I think that's worth highlighting. And so that was the case with Matthew Dennis here at number 60 on this list. So hopefully you can appreciate just kind of the different approach that I took to this list. And as a result, obviously, we're getting some different names. And number 59 on this list is kind of continuing in that vein. Number 59 is Yutaka Yamada. They kind of feel like partners on this list for many reasons. They're relatively unknown composers. They're both relative newcomers to my own musical repertoire, and they were introduced to me through projects that members of my family shared with me. It was Reagan that showed me My Octopus Teacher, and it was my cousin Brett that introduced me to the work of Yutaka Yamada. Both of these composers are obviously big believers in the art of incredible emotional piano composition. They're both, I would say, masters at that. And I think they're both responsible for some of the greatest single pieces of music I've ever heard. I don't know how highly the music for Vinland Saga, the anime, ranked among the hierarchy behind my cousin Brett's decision to introduce me to the show as my first true anime experience outside of like the kid stuff that I watched whenever I was a young child. But I can promise you it wasn't last. And while the storytelling and the incredible characters of the show, they definitely stood out to me as part of that experience. I don't think anything gripped me quite as much as the show's incredible score did. I was really impressed by obviously the quality of the music, but also the way that the creators used it and really let it breathe. I think they knew that they were onto something magical. It was not rare as I was watching the show for everything to just kind of drop out in terms of the audio outside of the music, just let the music breathe and speak life into these scenes. And I think that was a kind of showed an impressive level of restraint that maybe I didn't expect as just somebody on the outside looking in that didn't really understand a whole lot about the genre. Was a little bit surprised by in terms of anime's approach to music. So I think that kind of made the music hit home all the harder, and I was really impressed with the way that they used that. Yamada is responsible for scoring a number of other projects too. He's not just a one-trick pony like Matt Dennis was. He's responsible for obviously a lot of anime style stuff. I understand that he was behind the compositions for Tokyo Ghoul and Babylon, Great Pretender, and then most recently Yaiba Samurai Legend. And I can't speak for any of those projects, but I can tell you that if their music is even half as good as what he created for Vinland Saga, they must be incredible pieces of music indeed. So, yes, Yutaka Yamada, number 59 on this list. Number 58 is another composer, although he really kind of got to start more of as an arranger than a composer, and that is Rosen. And I kind of think of Rosen as one of those just really nice untold stories behind music making that you don't often hear about, but that is no less inspiring. Like many other modern composers, he actually started out as an arranger. It was largely arranging video game music, most prominently, and kind of the reason that I was first introduced to him was because of his work with the Legend of Zelda series. He has no less than six Zelda specific albums to his name, all of which are filled with truly inspired orchestrations of many of that series' main composer Koji Kondo's classic tunes, and I would argue their most compelling form. But because of my knowledge of him and just the times that I've spent listening to his music, I was really quite inspired when I earlier this year I played through Ember Lab's Kana Bridge of Spirits. That game was a 2021 release. It was originally a PlayStation 5 exclusive, although I think it has come to other platforms since then. But yeah, I played through that earlier this year, and I learned to after I finished the game, it's just not uncommon for me. I have this really big instrumental playlist that I do various things to, mostly work to it whenever I'm working at my desk. And so I was like, oh, I liked the Kana music in a lot, so I'll throw that in there. And then when I was going through the soundtrack, I realized that one of the game's main composers was none other than Rosen himself. So I thought that was really inspiring, from an arranger to a now credited and an award-winning composer. Rosen, I think he's an inspiration to all who tinker with and just try to perfect the art of music arrangement. And, with his work on Kana now, I would consider him one of the great rising stars in the industry today. So, really impressive guy. And, I can't reiterate enough how incredible some of that work he did with the Legend of Zelda series is. If you're a fan of Zelda and its music, as you probably should be, it's a lot of incredible stuff there. You got to check out Rosen's work because it might be the best that music has ever sounded. Okay, continuing our run of composers here, we got quite a few of them here in the upper 50s. Number 57 is a pair of composers that I linked together because they have been very linked throughout their careers, and that is Junichi Masuda and Go Ichinose. And noted collaborator here is Morikazu Aoki as well, who has also worked on quite a bit of the games that these two guys have worked on. But if you're not familiar with those names, I think you are familiar with their work more than likely because if you've ever played a Pokemon game, you owe a great debt to Junichi Masuda and Go Ichinos. Masuda has been with the series since the beginning. Was a programmer, he was the sound director, and he was the composer for the original titles. And he has been credited on literally every single mainline Pokemon title released since. So that's, coming up, well, basically a 30-year body of work right there. Goichi knows was not on the original games, but he joined as a composer starting with Pokemon Pinball, going back all the way to 1999. For context, I was in kindergarten that year, and he's continued to work with Masuda and just a litany of other Pokemon composers on every mainline release since then, starting with Pokemon Gold and Silver, which, if you're familiar with those games, you know how truly incredible the music was for those titles. It was a huge leap up from the first games, especially considering what they had to work with the very limited Game Boy sound chip. So both of these guys, though, are responsible for certainly some of the most nostalgic tunes to ever grace this pair of ears, and no doubt hundreds of millions of others. Like I said, the gold and silver soundtracks in particular just really stand out as a huge accomplishment. The quality and raw emotionality of the pieces that blanketed that title, I think, are second to none. And so I really just have great respect for both of these guys for what they were able to accomplish back then, with such limitations. But I understand that for people that didn't grow up with them like I did, those original releases with the Game Boy sound tune or sound chip might not hold up as well as maybe some of the more modern stuff. But the good news is there's no shortage of incredible arrangers and artists, including a couple of notable ones, I would say Dr. Pez and TPR, that have devoted just countless hours to properly orchestrating these great pieces of music with full instrumentation and really modernizing them and making them, music that really anybody would be able to listen to and enjoy and appreciate. So that's really great news, and that's why I think the work that arrangers do is so important, and I think is worth highlighting on this list, as I did just a second ago with Rosen. But yes, of course, the original composers deserve the majority of the credit as well. So that's Junichi Masuda and Go Ichinose, I mentioned collaborator Morikazu Aoki. I think Morikazu was did a lot of work on the Diamond or the Gen 4. So yes, Diamond and Pearl, basically the early DS games. Heart Gold and Soul Silver, they worked on that one as well. So I threw them in there as well. But Junichi Masuda and Go Ichinose, obviously kind of the OGs there, so giving them top billing. Okay, number 56 is our first non-composer on the list here today, and that is Gary Clark Jr. So unless you know Gary Clark before the release of his first EP, which was the Bright Lights EP, which came out back in 2011, unless you knew him before that, it would be impossible for you to be an earlier adopter of his work and his truly impressive, diverse approach to preserving the blues than I was. I remember listening to those four songs right when they released. It was these two incredible plugged in all out bangers and Bright Lights and Don't Know You a Thing. And then there were these two gorgeous, like acoustic and most impressively, I would argue, live recordings of Things Are Changing and When My Train Pulls In. I just remember listening to that EP with those four songs and just being absolutely blown away. And I remember at that time thinking I didn't know if I'd ever heard better guitar work than, especially just the way that Gary Clark kind of paired like guitar gymnastics. He's obviously very proficient with the guitar, but kind of coupling that with just raw soul and evocative emotion. I was just so struck by it at that time, and quite frankly, I'm still blown away by it. I still think he's one of the greatest guitarists I ever heard. His first big album, first LP, was 2012's Black and Blue. That was his first major label release, and then he followed that up with a double live LP in 2014, and that I think remains my favorite of his releases up to this date. I think he's just really great live. Kind of going back to like those two acoustic songs on the EP. You got like stuff like the haunted graveyard stomp of Numb, just undeniably cool. And then I still don't know if I've heard a better singular guitar solo than the nearly 3 minute stunner that he unleashes on Please Come Home on that live album. And then speaking of that song is just really impressive to me because it's got this amazing guitar work, but it's also got Gary Clark Jr. with this kind of Marvin Gaye-esque vocal register that when you put those together, it's just such a complete sound. And it all coming from this one guy. It's just unbelievably impressive. He's also done quite a few things since then, and some of his more modern releases. Last year, he released an album called JPEG Raw. Um, they have not focused so much on his guitar work, and I think that is to their detriment. I appreciate his commitment to evolution and kind of changing up his sound, and that's definitely what he's been doing in some of that newer stuff, and JPEG Raw in particular. It doesn't quite hit the same level for me as some of the more blues heavy work that he was doing, a decade ago, like I've talked about here. But the good news is, that stuff is still there, and you can still go back and listen to that. That unbelievable 10-minute combination of Third Stone from the Sun and If You Love Me Like You Say from that live album is always sitting there waiting to be rediscovered. Of course, as long as you own a physical copy of the record, because as far as I know, you actually can't listen to that for some reason on Spotify, which is very annoying. But yeah, man, I just really, I just go back and I think about how much I loved his early work and still do. It's really stuck with me over these last, almost 15 years at this point. So for that reason, Gary Clark Jr. is number 56 on this list. Number 55 is another band that I've been a listener of for quite some time. That is The National. I might not have been quite as early an adopter of The National as I was for Gary Clark Jr., but they were an early adopter of me. I'll never forget listening to, it was this Rolling Stone back in the day. I don't know if they still do this anymore because I'm not subscribed to them anymore, but back in the 2010s at least, they would do this thing every issue where they would highlight five songs that had, come out in the last couple of weeks because it was a bi-weekly magazine at that time, and they would just recommend these five tracks. And I still remember, and I always listen to them, but I particularly just really remember the first magazine that I had, which had the Black Eyed Peas on the cover. It was an early 2010 issue, and I just remember getting that issue and just poring over it cover to cover and listening to those five tracks and going through them and seeing what I thought. And it was basically my first exposure to new music that was recommended to me by Rolling Stone. And there was a lot of good stuff on there. I remember number one. I don't think they were actually ranked, but obviously they had to be written in a certain order. It's just by nature of writing things. And so the first one that I listened to was "You and Your Heart" by Jack Johnson. So I remember that, and then I remember listening to I Learned the Hard Way by Sharon Jones and the Dap Kings, and I enjoyed both of those. But none of the five hit me quite as much as the Nationals' Blood Buzz Ohio did, which featured frontman Matt Berninger's iconic baritone, and then kind of coupled with the record's almost lackadaisical approach to intimacy and, next morning repercussions. And yeah, so that really made a big impression on me at the time. I never heard anything quite like that. Obviously, Matt Berninger's uh, vocal delivery is obviously very unique in the space, very unlike anything I had heard at that time. And I still love Blood Buzz Ohio, but it's actually their 2017 release, Sleepwell Beast, that has stuck with me the most over the years. It has this incredible 1-2 emotional gut punch to wreck one right over the other on the album, call it with these two songs, I'll Still Destroy You, followed by Guilty Party. I think they're two of the all-time great examples of back-to-back sister tracks on an album, and they just kind of create this unforgettable duality of pain and regret that has really stuck with me unerringly for every year that has passed since. So, really love the National and their work there on various projects that they released, but Sleep Well Beast in particular kind of stands out as my favorite. So, yeah, been with the National for a long time, and they definitely remind when I hear them, they definitely take me back to you know my early days of listening to Rolling Stone, and just that was just such a fun time in my life as a music fan. Just really broadening my horizons just exponentially musically, just on a biweekly basis at that point. So it always takes me back listening to the National. Number 54, we have another composer here. This is Masayoshi Soken. So this is an interesting. I have a lot of things to say about this guy. So going back to obviously, if you know me at all, I'm a huge fan of Final Fantasy series, and Masayoshi Soken has been contributing some work to the Final Fantasy series of late. Obviously, the main Final Fantasy composer, going back to the beginning of the series, is Nobuo Uematsu, and his shoes have been really impossible to fill for Square and Final Fantasy ever since. After he left following his kind of parting gift really to that series was Final Fantasy X's unforgettable two Xanarkand composition. And since then, if you've been following the series, you'll know that Square Enix has kind of had to rely on a lot of other composers to try to fill the void that just that one man left behind, which is kind of emblematic of how incredible he was and still is to this day. And while many of those composers are responsible for some of the greatest music of the last 2 decades, I would argue, and I've highlighted some of them on this list already. I don't think any single man has managed to fill as much of that post Uematsu void as Masayoshi Soken. He is the lead composer of the massive and apparently never-ending Final Fantasy XIV, and then most recently, he was also the lead composer for Final Fantasy XVI. And his work on Final Fantasy 16 in particular has been particularly acclaimed. It won him that year's Game Award for Best Composer, and what many viewed as the slam dunk choice. And while I would personally argue that Octopath Traveler 2's Yasunori Nishiki got snubbed, and perhaps we'll discuss that in a future episode, that is no slight on the absolutely incredible and monstrous 181 song epic that is the Final Fantasy 16 soundtrack. There are any number of compositions from that work that I would argue stick out as truly fantastic. Um, but some of the ones that stick out to me are the string laden, lovely, dark and deep, the borderline unhinged, Titan Lost, and then I would maybe the most standout track for me, at least at this time, is the operatic "Away," which is put front and center during the game's opening sequence, featuring the fated and fiery battle between Phoenix and Ifrit. If you have played that game, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's an unforgivable moment for the series, taken over the top. It would be anyway, just based on just the how epic that scene is. But it's really taken over the top by Soken's emotional and driving score. I will say when I played the game in context, obviously I was really more focused on the scene itself, and it is an interactive scene, so of course I was trying to win the battle. And so I don't know if that I really fully appreciated just how fantastic Away as a composition is until I took the time to listen to it away, ironically, from the game itself. So just listening to it by itself, no visual aid or anything like that, just with headphones and just really focusing on the music there. I was just really blown away by how strong that music is. It actually kind of made me a little bit emotional, just thinking about the context of that game and just the emotional roller coaster that Final Fantasy 16 is. I don't think it gets enough credit as just a really well pinned and just super fun game. There was almost no point I was playing that game where I was like, man, I'm not having a good time, And I really, it's not like my number one Final Fantasy game or anything like that. It didn't hit me as hard as some of the older stuff, some of the more classic Final Fantasies, I will admit. But I still think it was a really great game, especially in the modern landscape of video games. And I just had such a fun time playing through that. And I really enjoyed it more than, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, which came out the next year. And actually still haven't finished Final Fantasy VII Rebirth after all this time. But 16, I blew through that one in like a month. I just and loved every second of it. Um, Going back to Masayoshi Soken, though, he's been quoted as saying that he often asks himself, what would Nobuo Uematsu do when composing for the Final Fantasy series? And I'm sure that is very flattering to the master composer if he's heard that. I can tell you that if Uematsu himself had penned away, I think it would still rank highly among his greatest pieces of work to date. And I can't think of any higher praise that I can levy on that piece of music in Masayoshi Soken's work than that. Okay, number 53, we have another band here and a famous one at that. Number 53 is Metallica. And one thing that I've always said about Metallica is I feel like most boys that have grown up in the United States since, say, the 1980s have, at least in some point in their lives, gone through a Metallica phase. For my brother and I, it hit around the release of the band's awesome 2008, I guess kind of a comeback album, which was Death Magnetic. I know that my stepdad was more than happy to encourage this newfound appreciation for Metallica's. It's an approachable brand of thrash metal, I would argue. And so he burned us some copies of some of their other work, particularly "And Justice for All." I remember he burned his copies for that, and this is kind of in our pre iPod era, so we were really listening to a lot of CDs back then. That was the way we listened to music, and so I definitely remember taking "And Justice for All" on a few spins with my portable CD player, and really got a lot of enjoyment out of that. I will say my mom was less enthusiastic about our Metallica phase. She got a hold of our because we had a physical copy of Death Magnetic, and if you've ever held that, yeah, I guess kids today probably don't really wouldn't really be able to understand this, but it was actually pretty high production values in terms of the case. Like it was really kind of created a book, and it used this art with that kind of iconic um, casket in the hole in the ground as the centerpiece, and they used different art with that hole, and it was pretty cool. Um, But I can see how it was a little bit alarming for my mom, who was she. We were definitely she tried to keep us pretty sheltered for sure, and she was I think kind of alarmed by some of the imagery in there, and particularly the lyrics in some of the songs. Probably some of the more suicidal stuff, I guess. I don't. It's been a long time since I've actually listened to Death Magnetic, so I'd have to. I'd be interested in going back and just kind of see experiencing again what it was that got her so concerned. But as a result of that experience, Metallica was actually the only band that I can recall that she ever tried to ban us from listening to. That did not work because my stepdad did not exactly acquiesce to that, and so we just, yeah, it's hard to police what music your kids are going to listen to, and I imagine it's even harder today. But even back then, it was hard to really police that, and so we listened to him anyway. But anyway, as a result, Metallica was the was a we I think that probably enhanced, frankly, our love and appreciation for the band at that time. Now, later on, as I kind of expanded my musical horizons with the iPod era and Rolling Stone and all that, like I was talking about earlier, I did kind of, quote unquote, grow out of my Metallica phase, and I was kind of found myself listening to them and that style of metal less and less over the years. It was actually my work on the top 500 greatest songs list, and by proxy, this artist list, that kind of reinstilled a newfound appreciation for the band and their greatest works like Master of Puppets and Ride the Lightning. I think those are both like really awesome albums front to back. And so, it's kind of one of the cool things about this project is that I've kind of gone back and reacquainted myself with some music that maybe I haven't listened to in a long time, but that used to really mean a lot to me. And Metallica is definitely a really good example of that. My brother, though, I think he kind of remains an aficionado for their earliest LP, which is Kill 'Em All. I definitely seen him sporting a shirt with the album's cover art, so that's funny. It seems like he didn't quite ever move on from Metallica like I did. And it's interesting. I never really fully latched on to a lot of Metallica's peers of the day. You had Pantera and Anthrax, and of course, maybe most notably Megadeth. But Metallica, I mean, I think there's a reason that they are way more famous and kind of well renowned than those groups are. I think they just have this blend of lyricism and thrash and really just straight up catchiness that remains irresistible for many, many millions of people to this day. And hey, I'll include myself in that, obviously, with my kind of going back to them in recent times and really appreciating their body of work. Number 53 on this list, I think, is a good spot for Metallica. Okay, 52 is a more modern act. This is Better Oblivion Community Center. So what this is it's a duo, obviously. Well, I guess it's not obvious from that name, but it's a duo of Phoebe Bridgers and Connor Oberst, who are obviously a couple of indie artists. Really, they kind of stand out as some of the best indie rock acts of the generation, I would say. Phoebe Bridgers, in particular, is very popular. She's amassed a following of over 11 million monthly listeners on Spotify. Um, I think it's her 2017 album Strange in the Alps and her 2020 album Punisher that definitely were big contributors to that. But for me, there was something magical about when these two joined forces to create this group, this project called Better Oblivion Community Center, and they released one album, this 2019 album of the same title. It's a lean album, which is, as I've discussed on previous episodes, my favorite kind of albums. I really like whenever they're, kind of 9, 10 songs and maybe 45 minutes in length. I find that that's usually the best albums are like that because there's just not a lot of bloat to them. There's no songs that are like, you could cut this one and that it would make the album better. And so this one's definitely in that vein. I really that album is really a tour de force of what makes indie music great. It's a modern classic in every sense of the word. It's got infectious bops like My City. It's very brilliant stuff, but nothing tops the 3.5 minute bombshell that is Dylan Thomas, which, you know, it might be better than any song that has released since that song came out in August 2019. These two, after releasing the album, they did a major tour, which wrapped in August 2019. So I guess the album came out earlier in 2019. So it wasn't a long tour, but they did tour together on the heels of the album. But sadly, they have not done anything together since. And so this is currently a one album project. They've gone back to their own solo projects. And so, as far as I can tell, they haven't shown any signs of reuniting. And while I would be there on day one to support anything they decided to pursue together, if that day ever comes, I think there's also something that's kind of special and poetic about just quietly releasing one of the greatest albums of the decade before just disappearing into the ether, like a fleeting yet memorable summer fling. So, Better Oblivion Community Center, really awesome album. I highly recommend it. Number 51 is a punk band. I might argue my favorite punk band. And this is the Banner Pilot. So ever since my early exposure to punk bands, like the Ramones and the Clash are obviously kind of the two most well-known ones probably. I've always kind of enjoyed the flippant and joyful nature of the genre. Um, but while various groups, including some highlighted earlier on this list, Giggy and the Stooges and Camper Van Beethoven, have utilized the genre's best attributes, I don't feel that any group has perfected it like the Minnesota-based Banner Pilot. Depending on how loosely you define the genre, which is admittedly nebulous on the fringes, I would consider the 2009 album that they did called Collapser as the greatest pure punk album ever released. And I think that's notable because, yeah, like I mentioned, it came out in 2009, long after the genre had hit its popularity peak in, like the 80s. But this album does not have a bad song on it. And in fact, other than maybe one or two, I don't think it really lacks a song that I wouldn't consider exemplary or standout. I think a lot of that is attributable to, of course, the band's impeccable rhythm section, combined with the singer Nick Johnson's evocative midnight howl. But and it's kind of hard to make out whenever you're just listening to him in a vacuum. But whenever you actually really focus on the lyricism of Nick Johnson, I really am impressed by his approach to surprisingly earnest lyricism. And I think that sort of juxtaposed against the rest of the music of the band, the very punk sound, is what strikes me the most. And I think that makes them stand out compared to really any other punk band that I've ever heard. And the fact that it's so missable under the band's otherwise kind of sneering sheen, it kind of sounds like a typical punk band, is what strikes me the most. And kind of makes it all the more special. Um, and I think it's emblematic of many of the truly great punk bands that have come onto the scene with little fanfare. Banner Pilot has, they never really had a ton of notoriety. They did their first album in 2006. They have not released anything since 2014 Souvenir. So they have a 5 album run to their name. Came and went, nary end to fame, right? Let me check on what their monthly listeners are. By the way, for comparison, Matthew Dennis, who has one project to his name, was 25,583. When I go to Banner Pilot, they are at 37,833. So a little more than Matt Dennis, but still, a drop in the bucket compared to what they deserve, I would argue. But truly, with that in mind, they are kind of representative of the genre at its best, which is, a well kept secret that's cherished and celebrated by the few who have been lucky enough to just discover them. But if you are a fan of punk music, and you are fans of bands like those, like that I mentioned there, the Ramones, the Clash, Iggy and the Stooges, just any of those the punk greats, I really implore you to check out the Banner Pilot. I think they are the best of that genre that I've heard. Okay, number 50 on this list. Boy, going from a relative unknown to one of the most famous pop stars of all time, and that is Madonna at number 50. Um, and, honestly, I was thinking whenever I was putting this list together, like if having, the Banner Pilot next to one of the biggest pop stars in the history of the US musical scene isn't emblematic enough of the variety of this list and eclecticism of my musical taste, I don't know what it is. But, frankly, the game was rigged from the start in terms of my appreciation of Madonna because she was one of the few artists I was exposed to at a young age that wasn't either 90s country or Christian music. Like I discussed on the first episode of the podcast of the series, going back to kind of talking about my musical upbringing. So go check that out if you haven't heard it already. But there were these, on occasions when my mom would take an evening trip to the grocery store or just be indisposed for a night. My stepdad would bring out the good stuff, whether that was on a trip to the movie theater or just a little jaunt to our local Lee's restaurant. He'd bust out some Madonna, and it was always pretty hype, I gotta tell you. Confessions on the Dance Floor, her album from the mid 2000s, was typically, which would have been new at that time, was usually his album of choice. But over the years, it's actually the precursor to that album, which is definitely not as well regarded, American Life, that has stuck with me the most. And I'll be honest, I haven't met many other fans of that album and its standout songs like American Life, the title track, and Hollywood. And, to be honest, I can kind of understand some of the criticisms of Madonna's ability as a lyric writer. She's not the greatest lyricist in the world. But as a total package, just as a pop star and with like great music backing and just like, the atmosphere of great pop music, I don't think few have ever hit it as big and as consistently as she has. You know, horrible plastic surgery be the end. Okay, 49, going back to another composer here. This is Sukasa Saito. And actually, I had originally, if you recall, going back to the original episode of this podcast, or I'm sorry, of this series, I had originally had Tsukasa Saito a lot higher on the list, but um, honestly, I was sort of overlooking, I think, just how good his output has been, and so I moved him up obviously quite a bit to number 49 here. So if composers like him are underappreciated, or compared to like some of the most prolific composers in our world, like Oz Wintry, I would argue that Tsukasa Saito kind of runs the risk of being overlooked entirely. But if you've been exposed to any of From Software's works of the last decade, particularly Bloodborne, which is my favorite, but also Dark Souls 3 and Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, then you know the importance of this man's work on those experiences. And the great news is that his music, even if you're not a fan of those games, or they're too hard for you, or you're just not a gamer in that way, you do not have to spend a second in them to take away the brilliance from some of his best work, like just Bloodborne in particular. The compositions like the first Hunter and Lawrence, the first Vicar, I think they would stand out as gothic masterpieces in any age. They certainly stand out in this current age where music like that is rare, and I think deserving of the highest praise. So for that reason, I've bumped Sukasa Saito up to number 49. And 48, I also was another composer that I bumped up from a previously lower spot on the list. Number 48 is Justin E. Bell, which is Obsidian's composer. And he is a contender for he's one of the composers with the least music to his name on this list. I think he probably has a little bit more than Matthew Dennis has, but he only has one project to his name as well, Justin E. Bell, and that is The Outer Worlds from 2019. But the music for that is so shockingly good that I can't help but give him a spot on this list and a spot of prestige on this list here at number 48. While the game itself, I think, is a solid effort from Obsidian, which frankly is a studio mostly known for developing sequels to superior games from superior studios like Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic 2 and Fallout New Vegas. The Outer Worlds is a wholly original effort that, while it's not as large scale as some of the other open world RPGs at that time, or of the 2010s. It did hit at a time in 2019 when people were hungry for something in the more traditional Fallout mold after Fallout 76's disastrous launch, and with Bethesda's own Starfield still many years away. So I enjoyed the Outer Worlds when I first played it, and it has grown somewhat in my opinion over time, I will even say. But the one aspect of the game that absolutely floored me in 2019 and still today is Justin Ebell's score. A clear John Williams influence there, particularly in the soundtrack's main theme, which goes for an impressive 8 minutes of it's just a soaring space opera triumph, quite frankly. But I'm also really appreciative of the more understated tones of tracks like Journey's End, which is a lot quieter and more piano led. And frankly, Bell's work is so good that I feel that it almost threatens to overshadow the main Outer Worlds product. And price woes aside, I am certainly looking forward to hearing what he has in store for the sequel, which is set for release later this year. Okay, number 47 on this list, not a composer. This is Brandi Carlile. Um, so this is a really interesting artist here. So over the last 2 decades, I would say few artists have managed to build up as incredible of a resume with relatively little fanfare, compared to what she's actually released as Brandi Carlile. She has 7 full length acclaimed albums to her name over the course of that time, and of course, a litany of awards across multiple academies, including both the Grammys and the Emmys. And then she's also released multiple offshoots and side projects in addition to those, including The Highwaymen, work with Tanya Tucker, and then most recently work with Elton John. But for me, it's just her solo work with just her that rings the truest and the most impressive. And particularly the one that stands out to me the most is 2018's By the Way I Forgive You, which is really just a tour de force of varied hard hitters, styles, and instrumentations backed by her haunted yet approachable yelp. That's how I would describe her kind of her sound. And so for a total package from songwriting to performance to output to creativity, it's hard to find much better than Brandi Carlile. Really great stuff to her name. I really recommend that you check her out. And now number 46. This is a big one. Number 46 is Aerosmith. And perhaps no band is more important in, or has been more important in defining my musical taste and my humble beginnings as an enthusiast of music than Aerosmith. This was officially my first favorite band, and they were the kind of the foundation upon which everything else has been built. Um, Now, my entry point for Aerosmith was humble. It was actually some of their more contemporary stuff. Surprisingly, my first favorite song by Aerosmith was this single called Girls of Summer, which was released in 2002. And that song has become so obsolete, I literally cannot even find it on Spotify. I don't think that you can listen to it on Spotify, which blows my mind. But it was actually that song that led off the mix CD that my dad made for me all those fateful years ago that I mentioned in the first episode of the series. And that just really blew me away at the time. It really kind of served as my gateway into music fandom. But it wasn't just that song. There were other releases from the band's catalog that were he included on that CD. Aerosmith definitely made up the plurality, I guess you could say, of the songs there. I don't think they were more than half, but they were on there more than anyone else. And that album or that CD included stuff like Dream On, going all the way back to their first album, and then kind of their more recent ballads like I Don't Want to Miss a Thing, which was pretty big at that time. And then it also had some deeper cuts on there, like Roadrunner and Never Loved a Girl from Aerosmith's 2004 LP of blues covers called Honkin' on Bobo. Apparently, my dad was a really big fan of that, and I guess it was new at that time, so I guess it was definitely their most recent release. Um, so yeah, I listened to those songs, those ones that he curated for me. That was my introduction to Aerosmith. And then at Walmart one day, I picked up a copy of Oh Yeah Ultimate Aerosmith Hits, which is also not on Spotify. But it was a truly fantastic 30 song collection of Aerosmith cuts from over the course of their 30-year history up to that point. It was awesome. And I still think that it would hold up really well as just a collection of great Aerosmith songs. It wouldn't, of course, hit all of their best stuff, but it would, for if you're a newcomer in Aerosmith, it would really, it was just an incredible introduction to their body of work. Of course, now I've listened to everything. Their full collection of studio LPs, warts and all, from the drug-fueled 70s heyday to the drug-fueled late 70s crash and burn to the rise again and ultimate commercial peak of their output from the late 80s and early 90s and all the weird stuff that they put out after that. Aerosmith's discography is certainly uneven, but it is hard to argue that it isn't the stuff that legends are made of, particularly that first run of 4 albums from their fantastic self-titled debut, 1973, through their remarkably consistent Rocks in 1976. You often see that album listed as one of the great rock albums of all time. But I don't think you should stop there because many of the band's greatest works, I would argue, can be found on their late 80s comeback albums, Permanent Vacation and Pump, both of which I think stand comfortably alongside the best of their 70s output. And they never really hit that stride again afterward. But even like their later albums, like 2003's Just Push Play and 2012's Music from Another Dimension, were varied, they were interesting, and they had plenty of good songs to their name. So, yeah, I just have so much love for Aerosmith. Obviously, they've fallen for me over the years. They're not my number one or anywhere near it. Here they are at number 46 on this list. But like I mentioned, there's no band has been more important for me of just getting me into music. And I owe so much to Aerosmith for just opening my eyes to how good music could be. They were so far and away better than anything I had ever heard up to that point in my life. And even if I have heard better stuff since then, I still just have so much love and appreciation for Aerosmith, and they mean more to me than almost any band ever could, really. Just as the ones that got me into the medium, frankly. So, um, I love them so much, and I'm happy to put them, in the top half of this list. They're not, you know, getting into the top 40 or anything, but number 46, I think, is a great spot for them. Okay, number 45. It's an interesting juxtaposition once again, following up on Aerosmith. Number 45 is Dr. Pez, who I mentioned earlier as one of the great arrangers of Pokemon music over the years. And I mentioned earlier as well that it would be easy to overlook some of the incredible music written for the Pokemon franchise, particularly in those early days, given its reputation as, just kind of a soulless corporate machine dedicated to the art of separating parents from their hard-earned money, for the last two generations. But we here at the Soundtrack Online are not in danger of making such a great mistake, with the childhood defining duo of Junichi Masuda and Go Ichinose given their appropriately high dues on this list already. But we would be remiss to stop there when the incredible work of Dr. Pez is free for all to consume on YouTube as a beacon of fantastic childhood memories and impressive musicianship. Much of the Good Doctor's channel is dedicated to multi instrumental prog based covers of great video game music, but none stand as tall as the unbelievable EP length masterworks he has created alongside a host of collaborators for the music of Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire and Pokemon Diamond and Pearl. Both are true works of art that somehow make coherent and musically impressive renditions of some of the greatest compositions from both titles, all recorded with live instruments and musicians from a wide variety of styles and backgrounds. And the result is just the definitive versions of already beloved compositions and an audio visual experience that no Pokemon fan should miss. If you're a Pokemon fan, you have not seen those videos. And like I said, they're basically full length EPs in terms of how long they are. You have to do it. I mean, they are epic. They are true works of art, masterpieces. And Dr. Pez has just really, I never really seen anything like it. Like, he's just unbelievable, and the way that he was able to put all that together and make it as coherent as he did, truly awesome stuff. So you got to check out Dr. Pez. Number 44 on this list, another band that actually means a lot to me, is Alvvays. I think I've done a pretty good job of including a mix of classic and modern artists on this list, but perhaps no post 2010 band has stuck with me over the last decade like Alvvays has. I was an immediate fan of their dreamy 2014 self-titled debut. When I first heard it, it was one of those that was got a high marks in Rolling Stone, and so I checked it out and immediately fell in love with it. I still to this day, over a decade later, consider it one of the greatest albums I've ever heard. And I think it is certainly my favorite debut album of the 21st century so far. It is, like I mentioned earlier, the exact kind of album that I love. It is lean. Has 9 songs. It is a whirlwind of whimsy and earnestness and wall of sound infused surf rock. And it's led by Molly Rankin's melancholy vocals. So yeah, love that album so much. They would be here probably, maybe not quite as high, but they would be on this list just based on the strength of that album. But then in 2017, they did Anti-Socialites, and that was another really awesome album. It may not quite have the peaks and consistency of the frankly untoppable original. I still think that it is similarly filled from front to back with lovely and often bitingly humorous tales of love, loss, desire, apathy, and depression. It's a really interesting mix of emotions for sure. And it's also only 10 songs. So, again, exactly the kind of album that I love. There may not be any record released since then that has filled me with as much excitement as that one did. I remember vividly the night that my brother and I, because he was a big fan of their first album as well, found out that they had a new lead single out in Undertow, which was the lead single for Antisocialites. We were just so excited about it, and we loved that song immediately, and just the excitement that we had listening to that. It's just, man, that was just a really great time in my life. And so that definitely sticks out to me. Um, they've done one other album since then. They did Blue Rev in 2022. And actually, I'll be honest, I haven't listened to it all the way through. I have listened to about half of it. And what I heard, I'll be honest, didn't hit quite as hard for me. But regardless, they have 2 modern classics to their name, and they remain firmly entrenched in my musical rotation and favor as one of my favorite bands still on the scene today. I think that there's two albums I think to this day that in my favorites playlist, I'm pretty picky about what gets into my favorites playlist. Right now, I only have 1,072 songs in it, and I'm constantly kicking stuff out, and every once in a while I'll bring some stuff in. It's actually been growing a little bit as of late while I've been working on all this stuff and I've been listening to a lot of albums too. But yeah, I'm really picky about it. And I think there's only two, as far as I know, there's only two albums where the entire album is in that playlist. One of them is Alvvays' 2014 self-titled debut. The other one is Darkness on the Edge of Town by Bruce Springsteen, my favorite album of all time. So that is the level of quality that we're talking about here. So for that reason, Alvvays number 44 on this list, well deserved. Now 43, this is going to bring my wife Reagan a lot of joy, and I think she's going to be surprised by how high this artist is on my list because he's one of her all-time favorites. Number 43 is Ben Howard. Um, and I think that he's always going to be kind of similarly to Alvvays. I haven't listened to him as long as Alvvays. She introduced me to him back in 2021. But I think he's similarly going to be a special one for me going forward, just given my personal experience with him. So I met my wife virtually for the first time on Valentine's Day 2021. And it was just when Texas, which is where I live, was getting hit by this massive and deadly winter storm called Uri. And it really iced out our streets and our electric grid for like an entire week. We were woefully unprepared. And as a result, despite an instant and palpable connection between me and Reagan, we were unable to meet each other in person for an entire week. And so one of the ways that we bided our time during that week, while we were just filled with anticipation about meeting each other, was we would send each other some of our favorite albums every day for each other to listen to. We kind of had a little um, crossfade going on if you're familiar with that podcast, where you each listen to an album and then talk about them. And the first one that she sent me was Ben Howard's 2011 debut, Every Kingdom, which at that time, and maybe even still today, I'm not sure, I'd have to check with her, she considered her favorite album of all time. So obviously I can't say the same. That is not my favorite album ever written, but I will say that the album's peaks, particularly the hauntingly beautiful Promise, and then the even more haunted kind of death rattle of Black Flies, easily stand among the greatest songs I've ever heard. And I just obviously am filled with such emotions listening to them because it just reminds me of that time in my life. And then, of course, when we finally did meet, Reagan and I, one of the first things we did together actually was on an early date. We watched Ben Howard's live stream performance from the Goonhilly Satellite Earth Station, which he did to promote the release of his new album, Collections from the Whiteout. And that made for this kind of ethereal, almost out of body experience for me that I remember very vividly. And I gotta check with her to see kind of what her memories are of listening to that album. But it was an interesting one. And honestly, that album might be even more consistently great than Every Kingdom, which is impressive considering it is not the kind of album that I typically am drawn to. It's 16 songs, it's an hour plus. But it might lack some of the highest points of Every Kingdom, but I do think it is very consistently strong. But even though if I don't like it quite as much as those songs, it has this oddly infectious earworm called Far Out that has just been lodged in my brain ever since I heard it. And it is a unique song. I feel like it's there's no song that I've ever heard has ever sounded quite like that song to me. And so it really stands out. So check that song out. Check out Every Kingdom. Check out Collections from the Whiteout and some of his other work. But yeah, Ben Howard, very unique artist and one that means a lot to me. So he's number 43 on this list. Okay, 42 is another composer, our final composer that we'll be discussing today, and that is Ken R. Gao. Now, while he may not be at the top of the list strictly as a musical artist, obviously he's not. He's here at number 42. I do consider Ken Gao to be, without question, one of the top 10 most talented individuals on this list. He's the single-handed creator of one of my favorite video games, stories, pieces of art, and history, which is 2011's indie tearjerker To the Moon. And in addition to writing, creating, and laying out the entire game himself single handedly, he also served as the game's sole composer, wherein he created some of the most touching and beautiful piano led music I've ever heard. And incredibly, he didn't stop there. He went on to create two other main games in his newfound series, including two other full soundtracks, again, all on his own. But the greatness of his musical work on To the Moon is just so strong. It can largely be condensed down to two fantastic tracks on that album, which is the To the Moon piano ending version of that song, and then the To the Moon medley, both of which are on the OST. You can listen to them on Spotify or anywhere else. But they really combine all of his main ideas and his best ideas into two phenomenal, heartfelt packages. But regardless of the medium, I cannot imagine a life that would not be positively impacted by his work. So I truly implore you to listen to the music of To the Moon and ideally play the game. It's a I talked about it on my top 25 video games of all time list, but it is the least ask that you can possibly have for someone to play a video game. There is no barrier to entry at all. It is no more than 4 hours. Anyone can play through it as long as you can read. There is no sort of nothing in there that, in terms of gameplay, it's very loud on gameplay. So there's nothing that anyone would be able to accomplish. And I think that everybody should because it's just an incredible art that I think is so relevant for everybody. It's just I can't say enough strong things about it. So I just implore everybody listening to this to give it a shot. Okay, and then closing out our list for today, number 41, we have Rage Against the Machine. Obviously the famed punk metal band from the 90s. Um, they're kind of an interesting group because they'll hit harder than just about any band can once you buy in. But I do recognize that Rage Against the Machine can be something of an acquired taste, which was what kind of my trajectory was with them. Like many of my generation, I was actually introduced to them through Tom Morello's involvement in Guitar Hero 3 back in the day on the PS2. And to say I was not a massive fan of his style or the song included in the game Bulls on Parade would be safe. But my reexamination of the band didn't really start until years later when Tom Morello had his stint with Bruce Springsteen's E Street Band in the early 2010s, most notably on the 2014 album High Hopes. So that was awesome. And then that same year, Rage Against the Machine's frontman Zach De La Rocha cameoed on Run the Jewels' legendary second album, which was really big on the college circuit, I can tell you, in 2014. So that was a kind of an interesting year in terms of, obviously those are not Rage Against the Machine projects, but it kind of made me interested in re-examining them and kind of seeing if I'd missed anything there. And I enjoyed both of those of their works that year. De La Roca has this kind of righteous flow to him that is definitely unique, and then Tom Morello has a frankly unhinged approach to guitar work. And so they're both like kind of notable in their own areas. But what I found whenever I went back and actually listened to Rage Against the Machine again, in context, listening to their albums, I realized that together, when they are coupled with that group's truly unbelievable rhythm section with Tom Comerford on bass and Brad Wilk on drums, they truly become greater than the sum of their parts. I think the best recording that they've done is Take the Power Back, and I think that perfectly illustrates how they are so much better together because it's just everything comes together. It's got this driving bass riff from Wilk, which is so freaking crazy good, maybe the best bass riff I've ever heard, and it bolsters Tom Morello's mid-song riffing that is kind of his signature, and then Zach De La Roca's just anti-capitalist yelp, just straight into the stratosphere. It's an incredible piece of music, and that whole first album that they did, it's kind of the one I think that is sort of the reason that they're so well known. It's just so unbelievably good. It is an incredibly strong album. It's only 10 songs. It's still fairly long at 10 songs just because their songs are pretty epic pieces of work, but it's just a really, really amazing album. I would put it up there as one of the best albums of all time. And particularly the first half. I do think it drops off a little bit in the second half, I'll be honest, but first half of that album is just like unbelievable. And so, it's Bomb Track, Killing in the Name, Take the Power Back, Bullet in the Head, Know Your Enemy, Wake Up. Like those are 6 of the first 7 songs. They're all just like so freaking good. So yeah, Rage Against the Machine, awesome group, man. If you can get into them, you can kind of get over the hump, which because I understand that they can be a little bit of acquired taste. They will really hit home for you. So, they don't have a ton of albums to their name. They've only done 4 albums, and they've never really released anything since Renegades in 2000 in terms of studio LPs. But gosh, like some of the best stuff of all time, and super influential as well. I mean, you can't like if you were listening to music at that time, or if you go back and listen to music at that time, it is so clear the influence that they had of merging this kind of metal sound, this really hard sound with hip hop, and it was just all the rage back then. And the fact that the lyrics that they did were so relevant then, and arguably even more relevant now. It's just like, man, what a band that has truly stood the test of time. So yeah, 41, Rage Against the Machine. They are going to be the top artists that we are going to highlight on this section of the series. So yes, that is it for this week of the podcast. Thank you for listening, and hope you enjoyed that. We still have, like I said, 2 episodes left to go, but here in a couple weeks, if all goes well, we will have our full list of the top 100 artists of all time. And like I said, you'll be able to check out that list on the soundtrackonline.com, which is where my main website. I post all of the episodes of the podcast there, and various other things that I've posted over the years there. So check that out if you're interested. But that is it for this week's episode of the podcast. If you are enjoying what we've been doing here, just remember that you can subscribe, follow, like, review wherever you listen to your podcasts. And of course, don't forget that you can write into the show at ControlledBurnes with an ES at gmail.com. That's it for now, and until next time, keep it warm.